Hey everybody, my name is Matt Strader, and in this video I'll be presenting on a little model that I made that will predict how much NBA players will get paid in 2020 free agency, as well as kind of just explore certain efficiency metrics and how much players are worth. So without further ado, let's get started. So like I said earlier, the problem introduction, or the challenge that I was given, was to create a model for how much a player is worth and how much they will get paid as a 2020 NBA free agent. The first step doing something like this is establishing a training set. And by this, I mean it's a set or a sample of data that you use to fit and test your model and just get out the initial kinks. So for this particular problem, I looked at 2019 free agency. And what I was really looking for was just like patterns and spending and the cumulative distribution, the CDF, if you will, of all of the potential available cap space in the NBA. So what I learned from doing this little free agency breakdown is that typically the top 20% of players, so your Kevin Durant's all the way down to Bojan Bogdanovic, those guys that are considered pretty valuable, the top 20% of the available crop, typically receive 50% of the cap space. So this past season, there was over like 1 billion cap or something, and it was about 17 or 18 players of the 90 so, 100 and so free agents received over 500 million per year as their annual average value. The second thing that I was looking into is basically how much cap will be available this coming summer. And basically the number that I landed around was about $500 to $600 million per year. And something that is another general observation is that there will be less top tier talent in this upcoming free agency period, which means teams might be looking to re-sign their younger guys and take risk on guys such as Brandon Ingram, Jaylen Brown, Karis LeVert, as well as others, hoping that they'll develop into those top tier talents. So now that we kind of have this framework of how free agency works based on our 2019 free agency, we now have to ask ourselves, how can we assess a player's future value? And a stat that comes to mind is VORP, which is value over replacement player, which the formula for how it's calculated is shown here. So it takes box plus or minus, adds to that value because a replacement player is worth -2 box BPM points. And how that is determined is a lot more stats that frankly I can't get into in a short 10-minute video. So the reason I chose VORP over, say, BPM is because VORP takes into account minutes and games played in the previous season, so it balances out based on not just their time on the court, but how much time they're on the court. And why this is a valuable stat is because it should track linearly or so with a player's value on the open market. That means that a player with a 4 VPM should be getting paid twice as much or more as a player with a 2 VPM. The other factor I wanted to take into account, of course, when you're signing a player and you're looking at their future, is how old they are. And that's pretty self-explanatory. You don't want to sign a 34-year-old or a 35-year-old to a super rich contract and pay them for their 37-year-old season, which will surely be showing signs of normal decline because of age. And then the third thing that I wanted to take into account was PER, and I know that's I want to say maybe tacky analytic because everybody uses it, but it is basically a number that rates a player's performance on the court on a permanent basis. And I included it in this model because I wanted it to reward players such as Anthony Davis that didn't play as much last season for whatever reason, whether it was an injury or circumstances surrounding the team. But when he was on the court, he had a PER that was off the charts, 30.6, and he should be rewarded for that. And I tried to include that just so it made up the difference for the value points that he missed out on VORP. So we came up with this new analytic that I like to call VORPage. And generally, VORPage is just VORP plus an age factor, which the way I determined that age factor in this was through basically a bunch of nested if statements. And depending on how old the player was, I would scale their added value. So a 34-year-old player who's past their prime would actually have points deducted from their VORP age or VORPage. And then a player that's 23 would get more points added to their VORPage than, say, a player that's 29. And then that little PER factor there at the end is just the player's PER minus and divided by the average, which is 15. So in the case of Anthony Davis, again, he had a 30 minus 15 divided by 15 gives him an extra VORPage point, which you'll see is important in this model as far as balancing. On that note, there were a couple balancing tweaks once I started messing around and had like the general model. I realized that when I had all my VORPage values printed out, it was highly skewed towards centers and power forwards. And the reason this was because a lot of these box score metrics seem to favor guys that have high rebounding, low turnovers, and high field goal percentages, which obviously plays into a center and power forward's favor, people that don't handle the ball as much. And then the other tweak that I had to make, just from an economic standpoint, was I had to take the options into consideration. And basically how I dealt with this was if it was a player option, the player would have a projected value based on their VORPage and their current contract year value, and whichever one was higher, the player would take. So in the example of Anthony Davis, again, Anthony Davis has a VORPage value that is greater than what he's getting paid now. So he takes his new contract and opts out of his player option. Whereas, say, Gordon Hayward, who didn't have a great year last year, opts into his player option, hoping that he can bounce back and then be an unrestricted free agent the following season. And then the club options or the team options are the inverse. So the team would like to keep a player that is worth more than their projected salary for the next season, or they were cut if the opposite was true. So if they weren't performing up to that standard, they'd be cut. So I had this all in a Excel spreadsheet, which you can see here, and I'll attach in an email. But final steps were basically putting this all together, making sure all the data was working out, and that there were no bugs in the code. And this is what we came up with. And basically, this is what the final product kind of came out to look like. So there's a lot going on in this graph, so I'll just take a second to go step by step of what's going on. First line, the title. This is a VORPage versus salary graph, and the orange points are the 2019 free agents and what they recently just signed for. So for example, this point, 41 million at 4 point some VORPage. That's Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant's signed for 3-4 years, more than 41 million. This point right here is Kyrie Irving. What we're interested in for this model is the blue points, who are the upcoming free agents. This is their VORPage based on how they performed last season. As you can see, there are some players who are in this region who, according to this trend line, which is based on the top free agents for 2019, are being overpaid for how much they are contributing according to VORPage. Some interesting points to take into account here. Anthony Davis is getting paid $25 million a year, and his Vorpage is right around 6. So incredibly high, and higher than anybody else on this list, including Kyrie and Kevin Durant. Gallinari is getting paid 23 million or so, 22 million, and he is right here, right on the line. Pascal Siakam, who was on a championship team and was an important player on that team, is getting paid, and he's on his rookie deal, if I'm not mistaken. So because of that, he is way outperforming and is a great, great value for the Raptors at the moment. But that will change because he's an unrestricted free agent and will be certainly due for a big payday. Some other points of interest that we'll highlight later are Eric Gordon and Jeff Teague. And the reason I'm highlighting these guys, they're veteran guards who apparently Vorpage does not favor, and it looks like they're overpaid. These guys in this group in general, I think Rajon Rondo and some other players are in this group, you'll see will suffer in this model, and they'll be valued at values way less than 13 to 19 million. But we'll talk about that later. So this is what a final product looks like. After putting all those data points into our Vorpage model, as you can see, we have the orange and the blue points again, but a lot of the blue points have moved. And a lot of them are on a nice line, which is to be expected because I did put it into a mathematical formula, but I've included these 10% error bars. So this is to say, Pascal Siakam, who was down here earlier, is now up here. I could see him getting paid anywhere between $27 to $23 million. He might even qualify for a max because I know Toronto has a lot of cap space going into next summer. But I just wanted to highlight 3 zones that I think this model did pretty well, taking into account. The first, the red and the yellow, were the player options, which are up here. As you'll see, players that are being paid more than this line would indicate all kept their player options, just like the program was supposed to. Down here, these guys who are outperforming their contracts are mostly team option guys. So right here is like De'Aaron Fox, and there are other young guys in here are on cheap deals at the moment and will ideally continue to get better and make similar jumps to Pascal Siakam did this year. This green region right here is interesting, and I wanted to highlight it because this is the region of either young players that are underperforming, but we gave them the benefit of the doubt, assuming that they would improve, and then older players that we assume will decline. So they fell off this original kind of projection line, and they get bumped down. So in here would be players like Marc Gasol, Kyle Lowry, Brandon Ingram, who else? Jaylen Brown, Hassan Whiteside, and some others. Andre Drummond maybe as well. But the reason I highlight this is because it shows that this model does a good job of separating players that are in their prime versus players that are either entering or leaving their prime. So after running this program and we've been able to visualize all the data, it's important to draw some conclusions and think about how we can improve the model that we currently have, because it is far from perfect. One thing that I guess this model does well is that it gives just a good baseline of where players should probably be paid based on their age and their on-court production. The one thing that this model and a lot of models probably have a hard time encapsulating is all of the context that surrounds each player's individual seasons. And I was able to kind of take into account certain ones and cancel out others, but there were still a lot of players that slip through the cracks and are either far overvalued, or in most cases for this model, undervalued. Another pro or positive of this model is that either way, it's able to identify interesting outliers. One that popped out to me while doing this was Willie Cauley-Stein. He played a little over 20, 23 minutes a game, and had great rebounding and efficiency numbers. And because of that, his VORP and his PER were pretty high, and he's a young center. So ideally, you should see him progress a little bit through the next couple of years, meaning that you could probably get him at a good value. And this model supports that, where he just signed a minimum deal, I believe. It was like $2.8 million. This model projects him at around a $9 to $11 million player, which would obviously be a good value for any team to pick up. And then on the other hand, there are players that had negative values for VORP, and they were below average in PER. Although due to some sort of circumstance, like an injury or whatever it might be, they're valued at basically a minimum contract. And that probably unfair. So all in all, it's a decent model, but it lacks a lot of context going from player to player. And frankly, it feels not super comprehensive. Like I said, it just provides a good baseline, but once you have the baseline, you still have to kind of do a lot of research and figure out whether or not it's a good value or not. Some further improvements and potential investigations that would be related to this model that could help us improve it is I've just listed 3 here. The first one being the contract year phenomenon. We'd basically ask ourselves, does it exist, and how can we avoid overpaying players that perform well in a contract year? And there have been studies done on this, and that's something to take into account if we were to continue improving with each iteration of this model. The second one would be injuries, and this kind of plays into the fact that this model doesn't do a good job of taking into account context for injuries and potential and whatever other strange circumstances surround a player. How can we change the Vorpich formula to balance itself with minor injuries? And then the third one, like I just kind of alluded to, is potential. The biggest downfall of this model was certainly how it undervalued younger players, because a lot of younger players have negative or have values less than a replacement level player, but the reason they're out there is to develop and get better. And that is something that is hard to model with math, because it really comes down to draft science, which we all know is far from an exact science. And what made a team think a player had potential in the draft could either come to fruition, and sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's 5 years, and other times it just never happens. And that's because, like I said, it's an inexact science. And lastly, on that point of being an inexact science, free agency also falls into that category. How much a player gets paid based on their performance the previous season obviously has a huge influence on that. But really, how numbers end up falling out, whether a player gets paid on a higher end of probably what they're valued at or lower end of what they're valued at, depends on fit with the team, who gets signed first. Recently in the NBA, there's been a trend of players teaming up and agencies and all that stuff. So all that stuff comes into effect, and because of that, it's important to keep nailing down mathematical models like this as best as we can in order to shrink that margin of error and build championship contending teams. that's all I have. The model is definitely a work in progress, but we have a good start here. I enjoyed this project, and it was a fun exercise for sure. And um, I'm Matthew Strader, and this was my presentation on how to create a model for 2020 free agency.